Um, So those of you who are new, I know we have a couple new folks here this morning today. Our custom is that I will give a little brief presentation, and then at the end we have Q&A, and I will ask you to, if you want to make a comment or ask a question, you can unmute yourself at that time. So anyway, let's go ahead and get going here. Today we conclude our Art of the Soul series. We have been examining the trauma of slavery and racism and the legacy it has left in the lives of some really outstanding African-American artists. I hope the life and work of these artists has also awoken something within those of us who are not African-American. And I don't mean excessive guilt, a debilitating sort of emotion, but I mean deep empathy and an expanded understanding of our society and our culture, our own natures, so that we can move about in our world with an enhanced ability to understand and to connect with those we may deem different from us. Carol Walker was born in 1969 in Stockton, California, to an artist father who was also a professor of art. At the age of 13, she moved with her father to Stone Mountain, Georgia, when he accepted a teaching position at Georgia State University. It was a culture shock, to say the least. Now, Stockton was a multicultural place. In school in Stone Mountain, Georgia, Cara was called a derogatory term beginning with the letter N. And she was called, perhaps not as bad, but close, a Yankee, and told she looked like a monkey. In Stone Mountain, there were regular rallies of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, this is the 1980s, folks, not all that long ago. Some of us may have forgotten about that. Regular rallies of the KKK reported on the evening news during the 80s and even into the 90s. Such a shock, the move from a multicultural community to one of overt racism against someone of her race, may have crippled the ambitions of most African Americans, but not Cara. She knew at the age of 3, when she saw her father painting, that she must become an artist too. And being told she looked like a monkey did not distract her from her purpose, but it ultimately gave her the content for her art. Her works are now in the permanent collections of renowned institutions such as the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, the Tate Gallery, and the Guggenheim Museum. Cara Walker's work is deceptively simple. We all have associations with silhouettes that contribute to the deception. Looking at these silhouettes, many of us may recall the stencils we've seen on children's playroom walls. When we first look at Cara Walker's silhouettes, we may temporarily, at least, be taken back to a more childish state of being and seeing. But after looking a while at such images, we are plunged into depths we weren't quite expecting. Here we see a black minstrel bent over. Why the slouched posture? Why the need to be wound up? Cara Walker doesn't clearly define the message in her work to make it easy on us. We have to engage with it for a while and bring our own experiences and our own awareness to the work. Perhaps the minstrel needs to be wound up because he is tired from so much performing, or he is simply beaten down by his daily existence as a third-class citizen, or because he is deemed no citizen at all. Perhaps he needs to be wound up again by a house slave to please his white master, or maybe because his music can sustain fellow slaves as they try to endure their awful lot. It's a complicated work, I think, striking in the use of black on white contrast. Does such a silhouette belong on the walls of a child's room? Would we be able to hang such a work on our walls? One thing I will say about Cara Walker's works, they don't merely bother us with their difficult messaging, they're humorous as well. Above in a joyous and farcical leap, a trumpeter blows music through his rear end. Cara Walker is having her laughs and proclaiming difficult truths at the same time. Cara Walker's silhouette works most often depict slave life or Jim Crow life. This work, with the long and descriptive title, Gone, an historical romance of a civil war as it occurred between the dusky thighs of one young negress and her heart, brought her to the attention of the larger art world. A couple of years after this work first was exhibited, Kara Walker became the youngest artist to receive a MacArthur Genius Grant at the ripe age of 27. Many of Kara Walker's works, such as this one, have been displayed as a cyclorama, in other words, in a round room, so you have no sense of a beginning or an end to the story. And she stated in an interview for Art 21 episode that her work gives the illusion that it's about the past. But once you've experienced it, you realize you are experiencing something all too familiar. In fact, our own present culture and the current experience of a race of people. Regardless of our race, many of us engaging Kara's works will probably feel a little saddened, dismayed, even disgusted. In this work, Kara hides these powerful effects in images that may very well evoke nostalgia for the gentility of the Old South. In fact, they are meant to evoke such a nostalgia before they smack us awake and into the present reality of slavery's legacy in all of its complexity. Here we are taken back to the days of Gone with the Wind, the story that inspired this work, the charming and disturbing antebellum South. People I knew when I was in school back in Virginia still pined for these days. They still greatly resented the defeat of the United States by the North. Did you catch that? If only the North had let us be and not tried to change our wonderful way of life. If only the North had not invaded the United States. That is exactly how one of my fellow graduate students referred to the Civil War. And I actually knew a man who claimed he was a proudly unreconstructed Southerner. The racial perspectives depicted in works such as this are still very present with us today, so let's not fool ourselves into believing different. Now, Kara Walker made herself read Gone with the Wind so that she could create a better work of art. She assumed she would find the work revolting, but she found herself not hating the work, but titillated by it, so as so many white Southerners have been. She found herself caught up in the story, charmed by the style of writing, the sense of place it evoked. As a modern African-American woman, she found herself both wanting to kill Scarlett O'Hara, the heroine, and wanting to be the heroine. Attraction and disgust are therefore intermingled in this work and many others of her work. She uses the silhouette because it's an inviting medium. It invites us in to examine a subject we might otherwise do everything in our power to avoid. So let's take a closer look at this genteel way of life for a moment. Our romance. A wealthy plantation owner, or more likely, I think, the privileged son of a wealthy plantation owner, has stolen away to a secret place where he can engage in passionate kisses with his young lover without worry of the judgmental eyes of a chaste Southern Christian culture. Able to enjoy the leisure of long afternoons with his lady in the shade of willows, maples, and oaks. The two young lovers are able to afford the finest clothes and charm one another because they have refined their manners at the best schools. All because these two come from families who have the benefits of a very large source of free labor. Notice the young gentleman's sheathed sword, a symbol of his power. How did they get to this remote secret location? Perhaps in this small boat on the right. Still in the boat is a slave woman reprimanding a mischievous young slave boy. Notice that the slave woman almost appears to be the boat itself. There is, of course, a double entendre here. For the sons of wealthy slave owners and the slave owners themselves often, excuse me for using this language, rode their young slave women whenever they wished. The women, of course, were not free to say no to this evil. Kara Walker stated in an interview about this work, the silhouette lends itself to avoidance of the subject, of not being able to look at it directly, yet there it is all the time, staring you in the face. There it is, the whole world of Gone with the Wind and its legacy, and the way that affects people's everyday encounters. The young child with two horns brought on the journey, perhaps an illegitimate child of the slave woman, holds a dead chicken, its neck wrung above the water. The child looks like it's playing with the chicken, or perhaps it's offering it as a gift to the boat woman. What does this image symbolize? Well, dead chickens, I think, could mean several things. The loss of power, for one. Also, chickens were used in voodoo rituals, so perhaps it represents the stereotype of the slaves still participating in their old, quote, demonic, unquote, African religions. But in West African culture, the chicken was a divine creature that represented power and wealth. So perhaps Kara presents the chicken symbol to us here in all of its enigmatic fullness. She also said in that interview, you know, Gone with the Wind is designed to avoid the confluence of disgust and desire and voluptuousness that are all wrapped up in this bizarre construct of racism. You know, what Black stands for in white America and what white stands for in white America are all loaded with our deepest psychological perversions and fears and longings. And it's a dangerous way of doing things, but it's just human, weirdly human. I like the way she finished that. You see, Kara Walker's works are not so much preachy as empathetic to a disturbing yet complex reality, the reality of being human in a multiracial world and in a post-slavery world. Now let's look at the right side. Above, a young sickly child is taken up to heaven. And below, an adolescent slave girl is giving birth to dead babies. And to the right, a slave owner has taken hold of a slave and is about to throw her to the ground. It is difficult not to feel disgust. Yet there is an intentional humor infused in this work. We are meant to observe the absurdity of our romanticizing of the horror of slavery once we see it for what it truly was. When we look at the work as a whole, we must acknowledge, as Kara Walker did, the all too human titillation of the romantic story we have constructed around American history and the complexity of racial relations. One more question. Who is this negress of the title that Walker presents us with? The negress that I initially was referring to was out of Thomas Dixon Jr.'s The Klansman. This is the great racist epic of the late 19th century that Birth of a Nation was based on. And there's a figure in there who's described as a tawny negress who is part secretary, part lover. This nefarious, dark vixen. She's manipulating this misguided white statesman who wants to put Blacks in higher offices and change the culture. And with this tawny negress, with this vixen, be the arbiter of our social norms. Could this icon of all that is wrong and sexual and vulgar be uplifted to the highest? My answer being, yes, she would. She will. This work is scene number 18 from a series called The Emancipation Approximation. The title is a direct play on the Emancipation Proclamation, of course, and the approximate approach to abolition put forth by President Lincoln. Scene number 18 that you see here obviously alludes to the structural hierarchy of Southern society and the slave class. The Black enslaved woman beneath the white woman in all socioeconomic aspects and accessibility is now depicted physically below her mistress, holding her up. And yet, look at the physical features of the face and head of these people. Kara Walker always presents the caricature features in her silhouette so that the figure's racial identities are abundantly clear. But here, I see an ambiguity. The black figure seems to have Caucasian features and the white figure that of an African American. What might Kara be up to presenting this image in this way? Is she inviting us into racial stereotypes and confronting us with statements that I just made so that we have to confront our own assumptions about what race is? This work is entitled Insurrection, and it has a parenthetical title. Our tools were rudimentary, yet we pressed on. To these stencils are added, as you can see, pink and blue light projections. And here we see a slave revolt, a white plantation owner's worst nightmare. This is a close-up of the disembowelment of a slave master. It is inspired by Thomas Aiken's paintings of dissections in medical school classrooms that he often painted. And here she depicts slaves disemboweling their slave master using, of all instruments, ladles. Remember that parenthetical title, our tools were rudimentary, yet we pressed on. When knives are not handy, I guess ladles will do. Again, Kara infuses humor into an otherwise disturbing image. Now, it may be difficult to see on the right, but it is a close-up of a slave having sexual relations with presumably her master. It is not so humorous, or maybe it is. It's not clear what is actually happening. A revolting slave is either raping her master, as he no doubt did to her repeatedly, or perhaps this is a sexual manipulation, the slave woman doing what she needs to do in order to survive. Perhaps, so characteristic of Walker's work, it is deliberately ambiguous. Either way, it is a parody of a horrible reality slave women had to face. It appears that the man's child is removing his shoes during the act. And on the far right, the wife swoons, looking at the horror of it all. Now here we see perhaps a better view of the two troubling scenes in a medium that allows us to consider this true story of American history, a story we didn't read about in our school history books. This is a quote from the Guggenheim website. Pushing derogatory caricatures to absurd limits, Walker overturns the diffusion of violence through comedy. Jokes are rerouted, punchlines go astray, and heroes and villains switch places. Walker herself inhabits these scenes as the negress, mischievously subverting any straight story. These theaters of horror thrive on the proximity between attraction and revulsion, drawing together love and hate, violence and tenderness, for a more complex approach to an unsettled historical problem. Here is one of her most recent and famous works, Slaughter of the Innocents, again, a parenthetical title, They Might Be Guilty of Something. They might be guilty of something. What an interesting way to describe it. Walker once stated of her work, I wanted to make work where the viewer wouldn't walk away. He would either giggle nervously, get pulled into history, fiction, into something totally demeaning and possibly very beautiful. Some people have described looking at Kara's art as an assault. It literally hurts to face it, to accept the story it tells, mainly, I believe, because we know it is true. Guilt, anger, revulsion are all natural responses to it. One thing few feel is neutrality. And every artist will tell you if someone feels neutral towards their work, it is death. Artists want to evoke a strong response, positive or negative. It does not matter. They just want us, the viewer, to feel something powerful. What do you feel looking at such a work? I will give you a moment before we examine a final masterpiece by the artist. With this massive sculpture you see here, I would like to return to the theme of trauma and addiction that we visited last week. The sculpture by Walker is popularly known as the White Sphinx. It is made entirely of refined sugar. This side view will give you a better sense of the scale of this massive work. It is 75 feet long, 35.5 feet high. And here is the actual very long and very descriptive title given by the artist herself. At the behest of creative time, Kara E. Walker has confected a subtlety, or the marvelous sugar baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet tastes from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino sugar refining plant. That is a mouthful. The Domino sugar refining plant is the warehouse you see that houses this sculpture. Here we have an image of an African woman slave presented in the stereotypical image of the mammy, one of many women who picked and processed sugar so the rest of us can enjoy what is the most used and abused addictive substance on the planet. You've heard me say this before, at least some of you have, but you know that sugar has a similar effect on the brain as cocaine. It is indeed a silent killer. It is the favorite food of cancer cells. And that is why medical professionals refer to sugar as candy for cancer. Now, we white folk among us used slaves perpetuating their trauma to give us a drug to treat our own trauma, but a drug which is slowly killing us. Kara Walker uses the image of the Sphinx for all of its complex references. It is in Egypt, the cradle of ancient civilization. The Sphinx connotes the exotic allure of this ancient place, a great civilization created with slave labor. Now look on the bottom right, at the left hand of the Sphinx. Notice the hand gesture. Some of you may recall my presentation on Michelangelo using that very hand gesture, an Italian hand gesture, in the Sistine Chapel. The thumb between the index and middle finger. It is the equivalent of our middle finger. Who do you think that is gestured toward? Kara Walker is a serious and seriously funny artist. Now, I think any of us could spend hours observing this work and dissecting all of the various references to our history and our culpability and spreading racial stereotypes and spreading trauma and treating trauma as well. I hope this particular work doesn't guilt us into paralysis, but causes us to reflect deeply on the original trauma of our own lives and how we are soothing that trauma and how we might heal from that trauma. And yes, I hope it allows us to reflect on the trauma we have caused others and perhaps amend our ways so that we may find greater human connection with all our fellow citizens. Once the plank is out of our own eye, we can begin the work of humbly doing our part to heal the trauma in others. It is part of the tragedy of the human condition and part of the opportunity for some semblance of personal redemption. And for that wonderful message, I want to thank the artist Kara Walker. And as always, I want to thank you for joining me again this Sunday for Art Brunch.